So we can start step 9, in which we're going to use output this time, and also use some external assets. But the important thing is going to be output, meaning just like what we had with input, it's used to pass information down from the parent to the child. We also have the reverse, so output, to send information back up from the child to the parent. Very often used during user events, DOM components, because we still often try to stick to this concept where we have more presentational components that shouldn't act on their own data, except in certain cases, not necessarily exceptional, but rather in fairly specific situations. For example, if the component needs to turn red when clicked, or if, say, a component switches from a cross to an unchecked state, things like that can be handled within the presentational component, within the DOM component. But for this particular goal, which is when clicking on an icon, to change the value present in this card, it's actually the smart component, meaning the parent component that should handle this change either by querying an external API, or in our case, since we weren't at that stage yet, simply by randomly changing the amount. In terms of visualization, that's how it will work. We're going to add an icon on the right, in the middle, right here. Well, I'll let you handle that part. Personally, I added it this way, and when clicked, the DOM component will need to send this information back up to the parent via an output. The parent catch is able to capture this user event and redirects it to a TypeScript function, so basically to a TypeScript wrap component, and then carries out its own specific logic. There will be many ways to do this at this stage, but the idea is to randomly modify the amount displayed on each of the cards. To show you how it works, every time I click, the corresponding component is updated. Okay. There are going to be several things, both the use of output and also assets. I'll let you play around with it a bit on your own. We'll go over it during the review. There is a way that's a bit cleaner than the others. We'll talk about it if you haven't found it. For the icons, I'm giving you two things, a CDN link that lets you import components, and another one you can click on, which will take you directly to get this I tag, so you have the exact tag needed to display that icon. So I'll let you handle that. This is going to be a pretty important step, because now we'll finally have both directions of parent-child communication, input and output. I'll see you right after. So let's take a look at step 9, where we want to have this kind of display with a click an icon that, when clicked, changes the amount shown here. We can start from the entry point here, so we're in BalanceCard. Here I've added an I tag, which is simply well. That's how FontAwesome displays icons, which when clicked will trigger a function in BalanceCard. This function will emit is really the keyword to no emit on an output, which is this variable accessible just like we had with inputs, a variable that will allow information to be received from the parent. Output is a variable that the parent will be able to receive. And here we're not sending anything, but in any case, it will still emit an event. It at least emits the action that took place. Depending on the situation, you can put parameters, array strings, a boolean, an object, you can put whatever you want. In our case, we didn't really need it, but it's always possible to add one if needed. So that's the first thing. To see a bit how it reacts, that's how it works. So in Angular, just a quick note, brackets are what allow you to address inputs. That means for this input here, I put brackets around it. This lets me say, I'm giving you this information using this variable, currency. The brackets let you interpret what's on the right as a TypeScript variable. It will need to be interpreted and then sent to this input. And finally, parentheses are used the other way around. Events received from out BalanceCard will be handled here. So the outputs here, like refreshed, this output is received here on the app side and redirects to this refresh function. The refresh functional, this is interesting. We pass in currency, which is the one we're looping over. So for each currency we have, we are going to pass it in. That's how we can tell, for this click, which element it should modify. Is it the first, the second, or the third one? Well, actually, we know that at creation. At creation, since we're looping over them, each currency will therefore correspond to Bitcoin, its value, the currency, and so on. And so when we create the order in the for loop and all that, we put whatever we're currently looping over into the parameters of this function. So with this function, which might seem a little bit complex, but it allows us to cover quite a few things. First of all, this thing here, actually in JavaScript and therefore in Angular, we like to maintain what's called an immutability system. That means the variables we use, we don't modify them on the fly. We only change them at the end and reassign this new value. We don't go through and modify each of the fields inside it. We only make the change once at the end by reassignment. So we have our array of base, of currency balance that we looped over here. So on this click, I'm going to loop over it using a map, and I do a simple equality check. If ever the currency I clicked, on which we got from here. So if then this label is equal to the label I'm currently looping over, at that point, I update the amount using a round. Another fairly important point, which isn't necessarily always known, is the use of the 3 dots. These 3 dots are called a spread operator, and they allow you to sort of flatten things out, to bring up each of the attributes of the object you've specified. We've already seen it a little bit on directives, on pipes. But the idea is that currency is an object of currency balance, so it contains several attributes. These 3 little dots here will let us take each attribute of currencies or amount, label, currency, etc. And then we flatten them onto this new object we're creating, and we modify the amount on it. So even if this one brings up the amount, it's overwritten by this one, and we randomly modify this component here. If ever this if condition isn't met, we return the currency as is, nothing is changed, and in the end we modify the currency just once and for all. That was probably the most complicated part. In any case, this is an implementation that's quite solid to implement. Another point was about, although maybe I can show it like this. Another point was about how to integrate this font library, this icon library, either way, and I think I mentioned it here as well. We have 2 options. One option, which I think you chose, is to add the CSS link directly in the HTML using the link I shared in the instructions. That's 8 works, and it will work without too many issues. But one of the interesting features is that the Angular JSON file, which is a file where we put a lot of build information, allows us to do this directly. So specifically here, it tells us that when I build, it includes the base style, CSS, and then this style. CSS is combined with different style files if we have others. But in any case, we can add onto it and say that, well, in addition to that, I want this CSS as well. This allows us to be directly linked to the build process. And actually, during the build, there's a whole part that will overwrite your HTML file. If you ever start putting some slightly static things in there, you start playing around a bit with generated files. So you're never really sure what will be modified during the build, because since these are files that get regenerated afterwards, it's not necessarily always the best way to go about modifying them. So in any case, that's one possibility. So we have a tag, or rather a style attribute, where we can specify all the CSS files we include. And in particular here, the FontAwesome files would be handled there. So there you go. To come back to that for a moment, so integrating the refresh icon that we got from FontAwesome, pretty standard with the clickable aspect, so we used it here. So the click parenthesis is common to all the tags you can find in Angular. It allows us to handle user clicks. Setting up the output, that's the most important part of this step. It allows us to send information from the child to the parent. Specifically, this child will react to this event, generate a random value in our case, but this will be completely different depending on the needs. However, what will always be common is the output. The output sends this data to the parent, and the parent reacts to this information. It will call services, store something elsewhere, fetch other data again, and so on. There will be a lot to do on that side of things. So between these two approaches, we generally prefer the Angular JSON method to modify scripts or styles. I showed the style part, but there's also the script part. We can add JavaScript files, just like we used to do, or as we tend to do if we come from a more traditional web background, by putting a script import at the bottom of the page. On the Angular side, we already have that. So there you go. I'm just repeating this a bit, yeah, the outputs. And now, finally, we start to have this upward communication, downward with the inputs, where the parent sends information into the inputs, and upward with the outputs, where information goes back up. This marks a pretty important step, because now we have this two-way communication between parents and children. We can now move on to step 10,